Elizabeth Carraway had never expected her quiet life in Bath to take such a strange turn. As a young teacher with modest means, she rarely travelled beyond the stone terraces of the city. Yet, one autumn morning, a letter arrived in her post. The envelope bore the crest of the Davenport family, an ancient household whose name carried weight across the Cotswolds. Inside, the handwriting was elegant, almost old-fashioned. It was Lady Davenport herself, inviting Elizabeth to spend some weeks at their estate, Rosehill Court. The reason was vaguely described as a need for companionship for their daughter, Margaret, who was celebrating her birthday. Elizabeth, puzzled by the request, could not imagine why a noble family would extend such an invitation to her, a simple teacher. Still, the prospect of visiting a grand estate stirred her curiosity. When she arrived at Rosehill Court, the great house loomed above the rolling hills. Its stone walls were covered in ivy, its windows glimmering with a pale light under the grey sky. A long gravel drive led to the front entrance, where two stone lions guarded the door. Elizabeth felt both awe and unease. Lady Davenport welcomed her with a gracious smile, though her eyes seemed watchful, as though measuring every word Elizabeth spoke. Margaret, the young woman of the house, appeared radiant yet restless, her laughter carrying a strange edge of desperation. The halls of Rosehill Court were adorned with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her wherever she walked. That night, as the household prepared for the grand celebration, Elizabeth wandered the corridors, absorbing the atmosphere of the manor. Behind the music and chatter, she sensed an undercurrent of tension. Servants whispered in corners, and doors were closed quickly when she passed. Something in the air pressed down on her, as though the house itself held its breath. When the clock struck midnight, the sound of laughter suddenly broke into panic. Elizabeth rushed towards the great hall. Guests were crying out, and Lady Davenport's face had turned pale with shock. Margaret, the radiant daughter of the house, had vanished without a trace. And in that moment, Elizabeth realized her invitation to Rosehill Court was far more than a gesture of kindness. It was the beginning of a mystery that could cost her everything. The great hall of Rosehill Court descended into chaos. Guests rushed in all directions, calling Margaret's name, yet no reply came. Lady Davenport collapsed into a chair, her face white as alabaster, while Lord Davenport barked orders to the servants. Elizabeth stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in disbelief. A search began at once. The grand staircase, the music room, the conservatory, every corner of the house was inspected, yet there was no sign of Margaret. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. Some of the guests whispered nervously that the manor was cursed, while others muttered about family secrets. Later that night, when the house had quietened and the guests retired to their rooms, Elizabeth found herself wandering the corridors once more. She passed tall windows where moonlight shone across the polished floor, and the silence pressed heavily around her. Then she heard it, a faint sound, like hurried footsteps echoing just ahead. She followed quickly, her shoes clicking softly against the stone. The sound led her to the east wing, where the air was cooler, the walls lined with faded tapestries. She saw no one, yet the whispers continued, distant but distinct. The words were unclear, but she thought she heard a name spoken in hushed tones. Elizabeth paused at a door half hidden in shadow. Its wood was old, the handle tarnished with age. She felt an odd pull, as though the door itself was waiting for her to open it. With a trembling hand, she reached forward, only to be startled by a voice behind her. "Miss Carraway," said Lord Davenport, his tall figure emerging from the gloom. "You should not be wandering these halls at night. There are places in Rosehill Court best left undisturbed." His tone was calm, yet the warning in his eyes was unmistakable. Elizabeth stepped back, unsettled. The whispers had ceased, the footsteps gone. She was left with only silence and the uneasy sense that the house itself was guarding its secrets. But as she returned to her chamber, she could not forget the faint sound she had heard. The name whispered in the dark. A name she would soon discover belonged not to the present, but to the shadowed past of Rosehill Court. The following morning, Rosehill Court appeared calm on the surface, yet the tension beneath was unmistakable. Servants moved quickly, avoiding eye contact, and Lady Davenport remained in her rooms, refusing breakfast. Lord Davenport, composed but stern, announced that the police would arrive by noon. Elizabeth, however, could not dismiss the unease that clung to her. The memory of whispers in the corridor haunted her thoughts. While the house prepared for questioning, she wandered quietly through the east wing, drawn once more to the door she had discovered the night before. The handle was cold beneath her hand. She tried it, but the door would not yield. The lock was firm, as though it had not been opened in years. Yet she felt sure the footsteps had led her there. Pressing her ear against the wood, she thought she heard something faint, a sigh, or perhaps the brushing of fabric. Just then, a maid appeared, carrying linens. The young woman froze at the sight of Elizabeth by the locked chamber. Her face drained of color. "You should not linger there, miss," the maid whispered quickly, glancing over her shoulder. "That room has been closed since long before I entered service here. No one dares speak of it." Elizabeth asked her why, but the maid shook her head and hurried away, leaving only her words to echo in Elizabeth's mind. Later, when the police arrived, the manor was searched with methodical precision. The gardens, the stables, the hidden passages that crisscrossed beneath the estate, none revealed a trace of Margaret. The locked chamber was mentioned only in hushed tones, dismissed by Lord Davenport as a storage room unworthy of attention. Yet Elizabeth noticed the officers did not press him further. That night, long after the household had gone to bed, Elizabeth lit a candle and returned to the east wing. The shadows clung to the walls, her flame flickering with each step. She stood once more before the locked chamber, her pulse quickening. And then she saw it, a slip of folded paper pushed beneath the door. She bent to pick it up, her hands trembling. In the candlelight, the single word scrawled across it made her breath catch. Margaret. Elizabeth scarcely slept that night. The single word on the slip of paper burned into her mind. Margaret. Someone had written it, someone behind the locked door. Yet how could that be, if the chamber had been sealed for decades? The following day, sunlight spilled through tall windows, but it did little to ease her unease. At breakfast, the Davenport family spoke little. Lord Davenport avoided Elizabeth's eyes, and Lady Davenport seemed distracted, stirring her tea without ever drinking it. After the meal, Elizabeth wandered through the manor's gallery, where portraits of long-dead ancestors lined the walls. Each figure stared down in solemn dignity, their frames gilded and heavy with dust. One canvas, however, stopped her in her tracks. The painting showed a young woman with strikingly familiar features. Her dark hair was gathered elegantly, her eyes vivid and full of life. The resemblance to Margaret was undeniable, though the portrait bore a date from over a century earlier. Beneath it, a brass plaque bore the name, Isabella Davenport. Elizabeth's breath quickened. Isabella, the name she had faintly heard whispered that first night. Could there be a connection between Margaret's disappearance and this long-dead ancestor? As she studied the portrait, she noticed something odd. The edge of the frame was not flush with the wall. Leaning closer, she realized the frame concealed a small gap, as though it had been shifted deliberately. She pressed against it, and the frame gave way, swinging slightly outward. Behind it was a narrow recess. Within the recess lay a bundle of papers, yellowed with age. Elizabeth drew them out carefully. Letters, tied with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was ornate, the ink darkened by time. The first began with words that made her blood run cold. To the one who finds this, beware the curse that binds Rosehill Court. Isabella's fate shall not be forgotten, nor forgiven. Before she could read further, the sound of footsteps echoed down the gallery. Elizabeth hurriedly pressed the letters back into the recess and pushed the frame into place. Lord Davenport appeared at the far end of the hall, his expression unreadable as his eyes swept towards her. "You seem very curious about our family history, Miss Carraway," he said softly, though there was no warmth in his tone. "Do take care. Curiosity can be a dangerous habit at Rosehill Court." Elizabeth forced a polite smile, but her pulse thundered in her ears. She knew now that Margaret's disappearance was bound to something far older, something rooted deep in the bloodline of the Davenports. And she feared the truth was far darker than she had ever imagined. The discovery of Isabella's letters gnawed at Elizabeth all day. She longed to return to the gallery and examine them in detail, yet Lord Davenport's watchful eyes made every step within the manor feel perilous. Servants hurried past her without a word, and Lady Davenport's silence seemed heavier than ever. That evening, when the household settled into uneasy quiet, Elizabeth stole away with a candle. She made her way through the gallery once more, her heart racing as she eased the portrait aside. The letters waited where she had left them. She untied the faded ribbon and scanned the brittle pages. The words spoke of love, betrayal, and vengeance. Isabella Davenport, it seemed, had been promised to one man but forced to marry another. The letters hinted at secret meetings, a hidden child, and a fate sealed within Rosehill Court itself. The final page ended abruptly, with a smear of ink as if torn from her hand in haste. Elizabeth's candlelight flickered against the wall, and something caught her eye. Behind the recess, the stonework bore faint grooves. She pressed against them, and to her astonishment, the wall shifted. With a low groan, a narrow panel opened, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. She hesitated, the chill of the air seeping from below. The steps were worn with age, their edges crumbling. Yet the pull of curiosity, and fear for Margaret, drove her forward. She descended slowly, her candle trembling in her grasp. The staircase led to a passage hidden within the walls. Dust lay thick, but she saw footprints disturbed upon it, fresh, leading deeper into the dark. Her pulse quickened. Someone had been here recently. Perhaps Margaret herself. The passage twisted, carrying her far beneath the manor. At last, she came upon a door of iron, bolted shut from the outside. Upon its surface was carved a single name. Isabella. Elizabeth lifted her candle higher, the light dancing across the iron. From behind the door came a sound so faint she thought she imagined it. A muffled cry. Elizabeth pressed her ear against the cold iron, her breath shallow. The muffled cry came again, faint but real. Someone was inside. Her first thought was Margaret, locked away in this forgotten chamber beneath the manor. She tugged at the bolt, but it would not move. Rust sealed it in place, and the iron door seemed immovable. Panic rose within her, yet she forced herself to think. If Margaret was inside, then someone in the household had put her there, and that someone must hold the key. She hurried back through the passage, her candle throwing wild shadows along the walls. Each step echoed, loud in the silence, and she feared discovery at any moment. At last she reached the gallery, sliding the portrait back into place just as footsteps approached. It was Lady Davenport. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she clasped Elizabeth's arm. "You must leave this house," she whispered urgently. "Before it is too late." Elizabeth stared at her in shock. "You know where Margaret is, do you not?" she asked, her voice low and steady. Lady Davenport's eyes filled with tears, yet she shook her head. "I cannot speak of it. There are oaths. There are debts. If you value your life, do not ask further." With that, she pulled away and vanished down the corridor, leaving Elizabeth trembling with confusion. That night, Elizabeth sat awake in her chamber, the candle guttering low. The letters of Isabella lay on her lap, their words circling in her mind. A curse. A hidden child. A fate bound to the walls of Rosehill Court. She felt the house pressing down upon her, the silence heavy with secrets. Then, just as she closed her eyes, a sound broke the stillness. The faintest of knocks against her door. She rose, her heart pounding, and opened it. No one stood outside. Only the empty corridor stretched before her. But on the floor lay another folded slip of paper. She bent to pick it up, her fingers shaking. In the wavering light, she read the words scrawled across it. She is not the first. The words on the slip of paper haunted Elizabeth long into the night. She is not the first. They echoed in her mind as she lay awake, the candle finally burning to nothing. If Margaret was not the first, then how many others had vanished within these walls? At dawn, she slipped quietly from her chamber, determined to search where none of the household would dare look. She carried only a small lamp, its glow flickering as she made her way to the east wing, the oldest part of Rosehill Court. The corridors were crumbling here, heavy with dust and silence, as though the house itself wished to forget what it contained. In a disused parlour she found a great stone hearth, long abandoned. Ash still lingered in its depths, though the fire had not been lit in years. Elizabeth knelt, running her fingers through the soot. At first, there was nothing. Then, her hand struck something hard. She pulled it free and gasped. It was a small child's shoe, blackened and warped by fire. The leather was brittle, the buckle half melted, yet it was unmistakably real. Her stomach twisted with dread. She was still staring at it when a voice behind her said, "You should not be here." Elizabeth spun round. It was Mr. Harwood, the steward. His usually calm expression was stern now, his eyes shadowed with something darker. "I was searching for answers," Elizabeth said quickly, hiding the shoe in her skirts. "This house is full of secrets. You know it, don't you?" Harwood stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I know enough to warn you. The mistress will not forgive your prying. There are debts on this estate, debts paid in blood as much as in coin." Before Elizabeth could press him further, a floorboard creaked in the corridor. Harwood's head snapped towards the sound. His face paled. "We are not alone," he whispered. Elizabeth froze, her lamp trembling in her hand. From the doorway came a shadow, tall, motionless, watching. She could not see the face, but she felt its gaze pierce her to the bone. Then the shadow stepped back, and the corridor fell silent. Elizabeth could not rid herself of the image of that shadow. Who had stood there, watching in silence? Fear pressed against her ribs, but a fiercer determination carried her forward. She could not turn back now. That night, as the household fell into uneasy slumber, Elizabeth crept once more to the east wing. The slip of paper, the shoe, the whispers, all pointed to one place she had not yet dared explore. At the far end of the corridor stood a door of iron, its lock ancient and rusted. With trembling hands she pushed, and to her shock it yielded. A foul, damp air swept over her as the door opened onto a stairwell descending into darkness. She lifted her lamp and stepped down, her footsteps echoing as though the house itself were listening. At the bottom lay a vaulted chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, each stacked with ledgers, letters, and trinkets that seemed to belong to the dead. But in the center stood a wooden chest, its lid half open. Elizabeth approached, her breath shallow. Inside were remnants of garments, ribbons, and keepsakes, a locket, a comb, a child's doll, scorched at the edges. And upon the lid, carved deep into the wood, was a single name repeated over and over, Margaret. Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth. Margaret's disappearance was not the first, but it was meant to be the last. The Davenports had been offering sacrifices, generation after generation, to preserve their fortune and their place at Rosehill Court. Suddenly, a voice filled the chamber. Cold, measured, unflinching. "You were never meant to see this." Elizabeth turned. In the doorway stood Lady Davenport herself, cloaked in shadow, her eyes burning with fury and something far more dangerous.